Hello, my name is Denver Henderson. I am the Programming Manager for the Williams County Public Library. This afternoon's program is The Border War, the Battle for Toledo. The main part of my talk takes place in the years 1835 and 36. That was the actual war for Toledo. But the origins of this conflict started in 1787, when the Congress of Confederation, which is the Congress that governed the country prior to the adoption of the Constitution, adopted the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Now that ordinance created what was then called the Northwest Territory. There were two provisions that will come into play in this program within the ordinance of Northwest Ordinance of 1887. That was that this territory was to be used to create no less than 3 and no more than 5 states. And in order for a territory to become a state, it had to take a census and have at least 60,000 citizens. Now, 60,000 white citizens, because it was already populated entirely by indigenous peoples. And the electors, under the provisions of both the Congress of Confederation and later the Constitution, were only white males of property attaining the age of 21 or over. So you had to have 60,000 white men over the age of 21 living in the territory. As you can see, they created out of this the modern states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan. There was some property left over, and they gave it to Minnesota later on. The first state to be formed out of this was Ohio, and then the second state to be formed was Indiana. Ohio started off with the Ohio Company settlement, which was in this little part of southeastern Ohio. It was primarily settled by New Englanders. I should back up and say that the Northwest Territory was actually created not only to double the size of the then United States, but this land was going to be used to pay soldiers from the American Revolution. Both the government of the United States under Confederation and under the early Constitution just didn't have enough money in the Treasury to pay the soldiers. So they were going to pay them off in land. And that's when they started opening it up. The Ohio Company settlement, actually there is the Scioto Basin within Ohio was called the Virginia Military District. That was going to be used to pay all the soldiers from Virginia. The Ohio Company was primarily just to get a foothold in the Northwest Territory and start the process of statehood. I am particularly fond of the Ohio Company settlement because that's how my family came to Ohio in 1798. So let's fast forward a little bit. They've adopted the United States Constitution. That also takes in the Northwest Ordinance. And Ohio in 1802 decides that they have enough people to possibly have the census. So they take the census and they find out that they have 62,000 and some odd souls residing within the Ohio Territory. Now, at this time, you had to have an act of Congress called an enabling act passed first in order for you to start the process of going from territory to state. So in 1802, they passed the Enabling Act, and Ohio starts its constitution. Now, of course, the southern boundary of Ohio was going to be the Ohio River. They had surveyed, when they surveyed the old Northwest Territory, this was one of the original survey lines that actually went straight up through Michigan into the eastern tip of the UP. So that was going to be the Indiana border. What to do about its northern border? Well, obviously, 3/4 of the border was going to be the shore of Lake Erie. What to do about this? So they decided that they would draw on the old Northwest Territory and that they would use the provision of using the southern tip of Lake Michigan. And they were going to use a map called the Mitchell Map of 1787. Other than the fact that the Lower Peninsula is much smaller, much narrower than it really is, it's the length of Lake Michigan. It's off. Lake Michigan actually comes down to about this meridian here. So drawing off of that, they decided that they would draw a line from the tip of Lake Michigan to the western east to the western shore of Lake Erie. If there was any discrepancy, they would actually tilt the line up to take in the Maumee River. This was the basis for that particular survey, but something happened. A trapper reported that actually Lake Michigan was further south than they had realized, and Ohio decided in the Enabling Act to kind of ignore that and draw the line anyway. And that would take in what is now most of lower Michigan, like Hillsdale County, Monroe County, would have been, their southern half would have been in Ohio. But, so Ohio becomes a state in 1803. They start to organize the territory of Michigan in 1815. And this is where it gets interesting. Michigan decides that they're going to go by the new map, which puts Lake Michigan where it's supposed to be, and they're going to draw their southern border off of it, which automatically puts us into a conflict. So Congress resolved that there would be a survey of the border in 1812. Well, what happens? War breaks out between Britain and the United States. It lasts till 1817, and the survey is abandoned. So in 1817, they decided that they're going to start the survey again. Now, the Surveyor General of the United States, who was in charge of that, was this man, Edward Tiffin. There's a slight conflict of interest in this, however. Edward Tiffin had served as the first governor of Ohio. So it was almost from the start tainted by this. Though he was a scrupulously honest man, at least for that time, Michigan said, well, we're not going to basically take your line into consideration. And when it came out, and then the survey came out, and they had put most of that section of Michigan, they had tilted it up, and it took in the mouth of the Maumee River, the city of what was then called, it wasn't called Toledo yet, and a lot of the strip of southern Michigan. Well, the territorial governor at the time, Lewis Cass, decided he didn't like that. So he called for his own survey. The top one is called the Harris Line. That is the survey that is now the border of Michigan and Ohio. This is the Fulton Line, because they hired a man named Fulton to do the Michigan survey. And they went off, this is the old tip of Lake Michigan. This is the new tip of Lake Michigan. So they went off the provision of delineating their survey from the tip of Lake Michigan, and it gives them all of this. This is 438 square miles of property. Now, I'm going to explain why. When Indiana came in after Ohio, they decided that they were going to do their survey of the upper one off of the true position of Lake Michigan, and they gave Indiana more frontage on Lake Michigan for the purposes of trade, and that ticked off Michigan again because they lost part of their southern territory. So they were bound and determined they were going to keep the disputed Toledo Strip. At this time, the governor of Ohio was Robert Lucas. This is 1835, when things started heating up. Prior to this, Michigan went by the Fulton Line, Ohio went by the Harris Line. They really didn't. Michigan quietly kind of settled that area, started charging taxes, set up governments. Ohio ignored it because it was basically a frontier. They still got trade in through Toledo. There were a few legal battles here and there, but it was just kind of quietly ignored, right? Now, Michigan wants to become a state. So they start the process of getting their census. They have 83,000 people in Michigan at that point. So they have the provisions to be a state. However, by this time, Ohio is a power in the United States Congress. Its congressional delegation, which was 15 people and 2 senators, decided that they were going to stop Michigan from being a state, particularly since they're going to want to become a state based on that border. Now things get real. Beforehand, it was just kind of a wishy-washy little deal. Now it's getting real. If Michigan is admitted as a state and this is their border, we lose access to Lake Erie in the west. They were also starting to do the Maumee Erie Canal. They had put in provisions to start that. We would lose access to it. We would have to pay Michigan a thoroughfare. I say we. I should say the state of Ohio. I'm a native Ohioan. The state of Ohio would have to pay Michigan a thoroughfare way to get up there. Lucas would not stand for this, and he puts all the power of the governorship into Congress, and the Enabling Act isn't passed, but Michigan goes ahead with the territorial election. And who's leading Michigan at that time? This is a man named Stevens T. Mason. Stevens T. Mason was known as the boy governor. Remember Lewis Cass I showed you the picture of that was a territorial governor? Well, Stevens was the territorial secretary. Andrew Jackson decided that Lewis Cass would make a great cabinet member, so he appoints Cass to his cabinet. Stevens, as the secretary, becomes the governor of the territory at the age of 19. Remember, you couldn't vote till you were 21. So he's running an entire territory as governor, and he couldn't even vote in one of the elections. He's a fascinating man. He dies at the age of 34 of pneumonia. But he's called the boy governor, and he later becomes elected the first true governor of the state of Michigan. How serious was this? Did Michigan really think they owned Toledo? This is a box in the Michigan State Archives that was made in that disputed area, and it says Toledo, Michigan on it. It was probably a ballot box or a militia box. There's some debate online. So, it's 1835. They decided that they're going to actually dispute this through the courts. But Governor Lucas, not wanting to waste any time, takes about 500 militiamen into the Strip, and he occupies Toledo. At the same time, Governor Mason gets 1,000 militiamen to come into the Strip, and they occupy it. So tensions are heating up. Lucas sends a group of people into Toledo to set up a circuit court, because one of the things to make it a city would be that it would have a court. Michigan starts taxing, and they both sides, Ohio and Michigan, pass a Penalties Act. For anyone who is trying to organize a government, Michigan will charge you $1,000 in fines and put you in prison. Ohio will charge you $1,000 in fines and expel you from the state. So it's starting to heat up a little bit, okay? The Battle of Phillips Corners, Governor Lucas sends some surveyors into the Strip to resurvey. Now, Congress is all for this because they don't want to have anything to do with it. Well, Michigan gets a wind of this, and they send troops in to stop this survey. And at Phillips Corners, the militia of Michigan captures 90 people, of which 9 of them are the surveyors. The rest of them head into Ohio. And it's the first battle and the only battle of the border war. By the way, I wrote down, if you want to go see the Battle of... It's at the north... This site is at the northwest corner of Ohio 109 and 120 in Seward, Ohio. So you can go up there and see it. All right, the battle between Ohio and Michigan goes national. At this time, Andrew Jackson is President of the United States. So in order to settle this whole thing, he sets up a 3-man commission, and he also goes to his Attorney General, Mr. Butler, and he says, what do you think? Butler comes back and says, well, you know, technically I agree with Michigan, and the law agrees with Michigan. And Jackson says, hold on, it's 1836. It's an election year. My vice president, Martin Van Buren, a Jacksonian Democrat, is running for president. And also, states can vote. Territories can't. Ohio had 25 electoral votes at that time. It also had 2 senators and 15 people in Congress. Michigan had 1 person in Congress that couldn't vote. It was the territorial representative. So Jackson says, okay, I'm not going to make Ohio angry. I'm going to side with them. But things are still heating up, and finally, the first and only casualty of the war is when the sheriff of Monroe County comes into Ohio to arrest Colonel James Pinckney and his entire family in Toledo because they're setting up courts. Now, Pinckney's son, To Pinckney, can you guess what his older brother was named? 1, stabbed a sheriff's deputy with a penknife. That is the first blood and the only blood drawn in the entire affair. So, a compromise is reached. Ohio will get Toledo and the disputed land, and Michigan will get the remaining 2/3 of the Upper Peninsula. Michigan does not like this idea. They think they're being ripped off. They think it's an entire land of nothing but rocks and trees and constant winter. So they hold a convention, and the electorate of Michigan rejects this idea. Well, the governor and the state government will not have this. They call for another constitutional convention in Ann Arbor in December of 1836. It's called the Frostbitten Convention because it was the temperature had dropped below 0 and the tensions within it were cold. And they adopted the resolution. Michigan was entered into the Union as a state with the Upper Peninsula, and Ohio finally got to keep the Strip and Toledo, which became a major port. By the way, did Ohio win? Did Michigan win? Ohio got Toledo and most of the northwest part of the state. Michigan got the Upper Peninsula, which had copper and iron ore and timber on it. The only state that lost in this thing, because I think they both won, was Wisconsin, because geographically the peninsula should have belonged to Wisconsin, but it now belongs to Michigan. This is Dover Township in Fulton County. It is one of the victims of this war, because if you'll see, the township is crooked. It goes over. That's actually because this is the old, what they call the old state line road. And if you look at a modern map and if you look at this map, county roads go up, over, and up. There are roads in Williams County that do the same thing. That's because the offset of the old way of surveying. And this is Williams County. As you can see, our northern tier of townships follows the old survey line. That's why they all slant. They follow the old survey line. That's what Michigan got. This is the old Northwest Territory line. So they already had this, and this is what was granted to them. And as I said, if you look at it, naturally, this should all be Wisconsin. But poor Wisconsin, it just got Green Bay. So did this settle the war? No, there were little skirmishes and little legal battles until 1915 when they finally did the final survey and they set up a series of markers, these markers, to delineate. There were 12 of them. They're about this tall and this round. I think they were like 18 inches tall. And the governors of Michigan and Ohio ceremonially shook hands across the border, and that laid it to rest. Or did it? Actually, it was laid to rest in a Supreme Court decision in 1973. What the border that had not been decided was the border of Michigan and Ohio in the middle of Lake Erie. Who owned this part of the lake and who owned that part of the lake? In the middle of it was an island, which is privately owned, called Turtle Island. The Supreme Court of the United States delineated the border finally in 1973 and split Turtle Island in two. Oh, not in two. The lower third became Ohio and the upper 2/3 became Michigan. So technically, the border war did not end until 1973. And that concludes my program on the border war or the battle for Toledo. Thank you.